While Canon and Sony are dominating the camera market, there are two other brands that beginner photographers often look at, and those are Fujifilm and Nikon. And so we're going to look at those two brands, specifically which one might be better for the beginner photographer. And at the end of the video, I'm going to offer up some recommendations as far as the best Nikon cameras and the best Fujifilm cameras for beginners. Now, before we get into this comparison video, I do want to make sure that we understand that the Fujifilm X system, and we're not going to be talking about the medium format system, but Fujifilm X is an APS-C only system. That's the smaller crop sensor, which is smaller than the 35 millimeter full frame sensors that you'll find in a lot of Nikon cameras. And Nikon does offer the APS-C crop sensor format like Fujifilm, but I do just want to point out that when we're starting to compare these systems, when we're comparing Fujifilm X versus Nikon full frame, we are going to have some divergence there that's important to remember. So first, let's look at the ease of use, ease of learning. It's important when you are starting off in photography and you're learning the basics, you want to have a camera that's going to be easy to use. Now, the Fujifilm X system, many of these cameras do not have the PASM mode dial that are found on a lot of other cameras. This dial that you'll find on nearly every other camera system makes it really easy to switch between exposure modes, to see which exposure mode you're in, and changing the different exposure variables that are changed in those different modes. I've taught thousands of Fujifilm photographers in my online Fujifilm camera and tutorial courses, and without a doubt, the number one pain point, if I, created a spreadsheet of which questions get the most attention, this is the number one thing that new photographers struggle with, is switching between the various exposure modes in most Fujifilm cameras. Like, how do you switch between shutter priority and manual exposure mode? Or, you can't figure out how to switch between automatic aperture or manual aperture. And that's because the Fujifilm cameras don't have that mode dial. Now, there's an exception to this. I find this method very intuitive, but I've been using these cameras for 10 years. It is a place where a lot of new photographers struggle. Now, there is one Fujifilm camera, the XS20, and its predecessor, the XS10, that does have this PASM mode dial. So not all Fujifilm cameras lack this. The XS20 does. But just know that if you have any other Fujifilm X camera, you might be struggling to switch between the various exposure modes. On top of that, Fujifilm cameras, for the most part, do not have that full auto mode, like that green auto position you see on a lot of cameras. Fujifilm cameras don't have this. It's like a point and shoot mode. So when you get stuck, you just don't know what to do, you can flip it over to full auto, and now it's a point and shoot camera. The only Fujifilm cameras that have this are, like I said, the XS20, and then the XT double digit series, like the XT30, XT50. Those have a lever on top of the camera where you can switch it to that full auto point and shoot mode if you get stuck. All Nikon cameras, except for the most expensive professional high-end bodies, do have this auto position for when you just want to go into point and shoot mode. And for this, I think Nikon cameras are a little bit better for that ease of learning, just because there are so many different camera options available that have the mode dial and the auto mode. Next, we're going to look at the price of entry. This may be the second most important thing or the most important thing for you when choosing between Fujifilm or Nikon as a beginning photographer. If you just compare APS-C cameras, like the Fujifilm XS20 with the kit lens and then the Nikon Z52 with a comparable kit lens, you'll see that that Fujifilm camera is quite a bit more expensive than the comparable Nikon camera. But when you start to compare the high-end Fujifilm X cameras with the high-end Nikon cameras, the full frame cameras, now those Nikon cameras are way more expensive than the Fujifilm cameras. However, they also have considerably more features and a full frame sensor. So this is where we can't really start to compare the two things. You probably won't and you shouldn't be going straight to those high end cameras at the very beginning when you're just learning photography. But you should keep this in mind for when you do decide to upgrade in the future. If you do want to go to the most advanced camera that these brands offer, the Nikon system is going to be much more expensive. But again, you are getting a lot more camera than what Fujifilm offers. If you do end up with a Nikon full frame camera, you're also going to be paying a lot more for the lenses. And this is just because those full frame lenses have to be physically larger than the APS-C lenses. However, there are so many Nikon lenses available just because the cameras have been around for a lot longer that the lens selection is a lot greater. Fujifilm does have great lenses. Nikon also has great affordable lenses for their APS-C cameras, and you can also swap full frame lenses and crop sensor lenses on all different Nikon bodies. Now let's look at the menus and controls. Fujifilm menus are a bit of a mess, but nowhere near as much of a mess as the Nikon menus. Now, this shouldn't really matter much to you. Both cameras offer great menu customization abilities, both with a custom My menu and then a customizable Quick menu. And you can check out some videos that I did specifically on customizing Fujifilm menus and customizing Nikon menus. So that does kind of make up for it. Fujifilm cameras also offer a lot more customization when it comes to the controls. Now, this can hinder a lot of beginner photographers just because you may become overwhelmed with like which fingers do I use for which controls and which control does what. I can't remember because there's so many. The Nikon cameras just have a very simple control layout. It's very good for learning photography and just going out and shooting. However, that may be something that you want to keep in mind for when you do become a more proficient photographer and you want those kind of customization options. Fujifilm cameras, the more expensive Fujifilm cameras, are going to give you those options. Now, I also love the actual physical controls on Fujifilm cameras, specifically the exposure compensation dial and the ISO dial. I can just rotate that dial to the value that I want, and it's set, and I can look at it and know what it is. The Nikon cameras, for the most part, almost all of them, they don't have these dials. They instead have an exposure compensation button and an ISO button that you have to press and then rotate one of the command dials to change the values. So I think that does make changing those controls a little bit more difficult. Again, it's could be insignificant to you. However, the Nikon Z cameras, what they do offer is touchscreen control for the exposure variables that Fujifilm does not offer. Now we're going to look at image quality and the sensors. And this should not matter much to you at all. If you want to spend all day comparing sensor performance charts, go ahead and knock yourself out. But I think your time would be better spent learning things like composition, the use of light, storytelling. It doesn't matter how good your sensor is if you don't know how to use any of the exposure modes or you don't know how to compose a photo. No one is going to find your images interesting if you can't master those basic foundations. And the sensor quality is not going to matter if you don't understand those things. What I will say is that both cameras offer great image quality. However, if you want to be able to style your photos in the camera, rather than having to do that on the computer, like sitting in front of the computer and moving all of those sliders around to stylize the photo how you want it, nothing beats Fujifilm's film simulations. They're way better, way more fun than the Nikon picture control. Nikon picture control is just the same picture, but with different settings for contrast and saturation. The Fujifilm film simulations give you much more creative ability by switching between the different film simulations depending on how you want to style your photo or tell that story. Let's now look at the sensors and the image resolution. Fujifilm, as far as I can tell for now, has committed to a sensor resolution of 50 megapixels in all of their Fujifilm X cameras going forward. Nikon, for the most part, is still at 24 megapixels for a lot of their cameras. Some of their high end cameras do offer 45 megapixels, but for the most part, for what I can tell, they're still sticking with 24 megapixels. Now, how many of you, when comparing camera specifications, the first thing you look at is sensor resolution, how many megapixels it has? I'll admit it, I used to do that, is I wanted the camera with the most amount of megapixels. But it's not really that cut and dry. Don't buy a camera based on that specification. Sure, 50 megapixels is nice if you want to be able to do some extreme cropping in all of your photos without losing too much resolution. You have a lot of pixels to work with. That's going to require a lot more digital storage and a lot more memory for whatever processing program that you're using because you are editing a larger file with a lot more pixels. 24 megapixels, which is mostly what Nikon is using, has kind of been the standard for close to 15 years. It's worked for almost everyone because it's a really nice sweet spot to be able to make really good prints, have very high resolution images to display digitally, and it just works. And you don't have the penalties of increased storage and higher performance requirements for your image processors. There's one other thing, and this is kind of a technical scientific thing that's going to a topic for another day, but when you're cramming 50 million pixels on a small APS-C sensor a la Fujifilm, those pixels aren't going to perform as well as if you only have 24 million pixels on a larger sensor for the Nikon cameras. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but it is something that you need to think about when choosing a camera. And then finally, what about growth opportunities? You're just starting your photography journey. Now what? Which camera system is going to allow you to grow and to be able to provide what you need as you get more and more advanced as a photographer? This one is much more difficult to answer, and I wish I could offer an explanation or an answer to you. But just know that if you start in the Fujifilm X system, which is only APS-C, that doesn't mean that you're eventually going to, age out or be limited by that crop sensor system. There are countless photographers out there, very successful photographers, who are making a living using the Fujifilm X APS-C cameras. I just want to point this out because there is some sentiment out there by people that you need to have a full frame camera if you want to be a professional photographer. But that doesn't seem to have been the case for so many Fujifilm X users who are using those cameras professionally. Now, this is not the case for everyone, however. Some people do need the full frame sensor or other features that Nikon offers. And Nikon, their cameras, they do offer a lot more room for you to be able to jump around up and down the line of different camera models that they offer and back and forth between APS-C and full frame. The Nikon X system is a lot smaller. Now, they do offer a lot of camera models, but those camera models are mostly just a different way to interface with the same features. So, a different camera body, but the same features. Yes, there are differences in some of the camera features, but for the most part, they are largely the same as compared to the Nikon system. So know that you have a lot more room to jump around with Nikon. So to wrap things up, when you're looking at Fujifilm or Nikon as a beginner photographer, it's important to look at more than just the specifications. If you want a camera that's really easy to operate without all of the confusing controls, Nikon might be a better option for you, with the exception of the Fujifilm XS20. And what about the price? If you just want a good APS-C camera with a good lens, Nikon is also going to be a lot friendlier to your bank account than if you were to start with the comparable camera in the Fujifilm system. However, if you grow into the Nikon system and want to eventually switch to full frame, now you're going to be investing more money in that system. And then image quality. If you just want to be able to style your images in the camera and have a lot more creative control, then Fujifilm is going to be the better option there. Just know that if you want to stick with the newest Fujifilm cameras, you're going to be stuck with 50 megapixels, which might be overkill for what you need. I know this video presented a lot of this camera is great for this, but it's not so great for this, and that may not have solidified anything for you. But I hope what I did do here is offer some considerations that you should look at when choosing between Nikon or Fujifilm as kind of like your first camera system. You're just going to have to assess, where you are, what kind of photography that you want to do, think about all of these things, and then choose a system. If you have any other questions about any of these or other considerations, please let me know in the comments. Before we end this video here, I do just want to offer some of my recommendations for the best Nikon and Fujifilm cameras for beginners, starting with Fujifilm. I would recommend the XS20 because it does have that mode dial, so it's very easy to switch exposure modes. It has that auto position for when you just need point and shoot, but it also has a lot of advanced features that you can start using as you become more proficient with the camera. If you are ready to tackle how to change the exposure modes without a PASM dial, then I would recommend the Fujifilm X-T30 Mark II, which is 26 megapixels, or the new X-T50, which is 50 megapixels. These are nice small cameras to get started with, and they also have that auto lever for if you just need to get into a simple point and shoot mode. As far as the best Nikon cameras for beginners, I am going to recommend mirrorless because that is the way of the future versus DSLRs. And we are going to start with the APS-C Z50 Mark II. This is a very intuitive, very easy camera to operate. And because it is Nikon's newest camera, as of this recording, it does have a lot of the more advanced features that are found in the more expensive Nikon cameras that you can start using when you're ready for them. And this should let you be able to hang on to that camera for quite some time. That is that smaller APS-C sensor. If you want to start with a full frame camera, then I would recommend the Z6 Mark II. Despite that being replaced by the Z6 Mark III, the Mark II version is still very easy to use. It's a great camera for beginners, and because it was replaced by the Z6 III, the price has come down quite a bit, and it will allow you to grow into the Nikon system without having to spend too much money up front. Regardless of which system you end up with, I do offer technical courses for both Fujifilm cameras and the Nikon mirrorless cameras, which you can find in the link on the screen with a coupon code for 20% off. If you have any other questions or comments, things you want to add about Nikon versus Fujifilm cameras, please let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more great tips like this every week, and we'll see you again in the next video.